the fear in their eyes before.
I had a good money in the car.
Johnny Whited called Decatur police confessing to the murder.
Just the nick of time before he took the photo.
Handcuffs were used in Marion Clark's murder.
The following stories tell the tale of 3 of some of the most horrific confessions of murder that you'll ever hear. They are guaranteed to send a shiver down your spine. Samuel Little is perhaps one of the most sadistic and infamous serial killers of all time, and his story is scary enough to shock even the most seasoned true crime fan. This story begins way back in 1970, when a woman is found to death and laid in a shallow grave in Florida. What investigators did not know at the time was that this woman's killing would only be the first of a very, very long string of senseless and diabolical murders. Over the span of more than 3 decades to follow, many bodies would turn up across a multitude of different states. Police had no idea what the motive could be or who could have been behind these seemingly random and horrific acts. It would be many years before police would ever be able to connect these killings to one man, Mr. Samuel Little. Samuel was born on June 7th of 1940 in Reynolds, Georgia. He had what he claimed was an unstable family life. And while he was still quite young when he moved from Georgia to Ohio, where he was brought up by his grandmother, he attended Hawthorne Junior High School when he got older, but soon began to fall into trouble. Even at just a young age, Samuel experienced disturbing and violent fantasies, often involving hurting women. He would even collect crime articles that featured stories of men and women. Samuel's criminal activity began when he was still young. He was still a child when he faced a breaking and entering charge and was eventually sent to a juvenile correctional facility. Upon his release, he moved to live with his grandmother and began taking various drugs. While it seemed as if he was trying to get his life back on track, he would unfortunately only go on to fall into a string of many more crimes. He was charged with everything from robbery to assault to solicitation, fraud, and even shoplifting, among other crimes. Samuel would ultimately be arrested around 26 different times throughout the years across a multitude of different states, and he would spend as long as 3 years in prison for one particular breaking and entering charge. And yet, he still hadn't been charged in the most horrific crimes he would end up committing. It wasn't until 1982 that Samuel would ultimately end up arrested again in connection to the killing of a 22-year-old woman by the name of Melinda Rose Lapre. Melinda had gone missing in September of that same year, but before Samuel could face justice for this murder, he was connected to another killing. This time, the connection was to that of another young woman, a 22-year-old named Patricia Ann Mount, whose body had been discovered in September of 1982. Ultimately, Samuel was not at the time proven guilty of these crimes, and he ultimately was released from prison and given the opportunity to commit more deadly crimes. One of his crimes was for the kidnapping and beating of 22-year-old Lori Barrows, a woman who ultimately survived. While he was initially arrested, he was released and committed another crime soon after. This time, he beat and strangled another woman and was caught by police. He only served 2.5 years in prison for these crimes and then was released, where he would go on to move to Los Angeles, where he would commit many more killings. It is believed that he took the lives of around 93 women throughout his lifetime. It wasn't until September 5th of 2012 when Samuel was finally arrested, strangely not for murder but for a charge. However, investigators would ultimately use his DNA to connect him with the killings of several women. He would be found guilty for these killings and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole in 2014. While at the time of his sentencing, Samuel had claimed his innocence, he would change his tune just a few years later when he proudly confessed to his many murders, providing investigators with gory details regarding how he callously and without guilt claimed the women's lives. This is him casually discussing how he concealed the body of an unnamed victim he killed in 1993.
There's a lot of bushes and brushes us beside the road before you got to that motel. That's where I pulled her body out and rolled it down there.
Samuel used multiple different killing methods, and they were all brutal.
He would take his hands and he would put them on their throats, and he would them, and sometimes he would allow them to revive, so he could see the fear in their eyes before them out finally.
Samuel was truly sadistic and enjoyed every aspect of the kill. In this confession tape, he can be heard explaining the process of one of his victims.
I was squeezing hard enough for the breath could be cut off, and sooner or later she gonna start wanting to catch a breath, and that's when she tried to pull my hands off. It was too late then.
Samuel was clearly proud of the number of killings he was able to get away with throughout his lifetime. Despite being arrested numerous times over the years, he was always released and even allowed to go on to commit more killings. It wasn't until he was an old man that he was eventually captured. He proudly told the story of one particular occasion when he was confronted by a police officer immediately after just killing a woman.
I was lucky in Florida. I had a dead body in the car. Got to get the out. Yes, and I'm getting ready. But boom, 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 blue lights everywhere. Police car and come back behind the building. He seen us parked there. I jumped out the car and tried to act like I was zipping my pants. He said, "Oh, what's going on over here?" I said, "Nothing." I said, "Me and my wife just coming in the course."
He went on to explain that the police officer came over to his car and shone the light into it, right upon where the dead body was laying, unconcealed.
Just in the nick of time before he took us in a look. And I got away like that. He said, "Well, you gotta get out of here." Wow. I got in the car and took off.
Despite the fact that Samuel was cold-hearted enough to take the lives of these many, many victims, he strangely wasn't very fond of blood. In fact, he disliked it so much that he was always careful not to spill the blood of his victims, and would instead find other ways to kill them.
I never cut, stabbed, burnt, bit. No, none of that. No blood. I don't like blood.
One of Samuel's most common methods of killing his victims involved striking them in the head and then them. He would then dump the bodies in remote areas where they would not be found until they deteriorated to the point that they could no longer be recognized. He would dispose of his victim in the most inhumane ways, and at one point even left a body at a pig farm.
I found about a pig farm or something. Wow. And that's how they found the girl that laying in the field next to the pig farm. All the mother in ate off her face. The rats got over.
While Samuel had several close calls throughout the years, one of the times he was most in danger of getting caught was when the police suspected him to be connected to two particularly brutal murders.
We believe he was responsible for Melinda Lucre's murder in 1982, and we know absolutely he was responsible for Patricia Mount's case.
When Samuel met Patricia, the two drove around together in his car. While she may have thought that they were just taking a simple joyride, Samuel's thoughts were focused on killing her.
She let me feel her throat. I was caressing it. And before I knew it, I tightened my hands around it.
Patricia's naked body was later found lying in a hayfield. Police found hair fibers on her body that linked Samuel to her death. He was arrested and went to trial, but once again, he got lucky and went free. People looking back at this case will now likely in part blame law enforcement for allowing Samuel to get away with his crimes for so many years. If he had only been convicted for one of his earlier offenses, there's no telling how many lives could have been spared. The question still remained, what was Samuel's motive for killing all of these women? It seemed to be largely tied to the fantasies he had starting when he was a child. In one particular interview, Samuel recalled being only around 5 years old when he noticed that he was attracted to his teacher's neck. Ever since then, he fantasized about women. In one interview, he was asked why, if he had been having these fantasies for so long, did he wait until the age of 30 to make his first kill? He responded that over the years, he could only imagine killing someone. He didn't think he would be able to actually do it.
I didn't think it was, I was gonna make it into reality.
Of course, after he experienced the high he got from his first kill, he knew there would be more. With every kill, it was like he was feeding a deranged addiction, and he could never get enough. Because Samuel remembered the killings in such great detail, police were able to match up his stories to that of many cold cases, allowing families of the deceased to finally get closure regarding what happened to their loved one. However, a great number of his victims were homeless, hooked on illegal substances, and otherwise not in contact with their families. Because of this, whenever they went missing, their disappearance was never reported, and so their identities were never determined. We do know that the highest number of Samuel's slayings occurred in California, but he also killed in other states, including Illinois, Tennessee, Ohio, Florida, Arkansas, Nevada, Arizona, Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, Maryland, and Texas. He will go down in history as one of the most horrific, calculated, and prolific serial killers of all time. Samuel died at the age of 80 in California while serving his life sentence. While his official cause of death was not released to the public, it was known that he had a number of health conditions such as diabetes and heart problems. He was also confined to a wheelchair. This killer is so infamous that he earned himself the dark and sinister name, the New York Ripper. This story starts in the year 1946, when Richard was born in Bronx, New York. His childhood was relatively stable and normal. He was the oldest of 4 children and had 3 younger sisters. His mother was a stay-at-home mom while his father worked for an insurance agency. When Richard was 12, his family would end up moving out of New York and relocating to New Jersey. Richard would have trouble fitting in at his new school for several reasons. He wasn't very athletic, so he couldn't participate in many sports, and he also suffered from poor eyesight. Despite these challenges, things ended up getting better for him when he got to high school. He became a member of the track team and found that he was a good competitor. After graduating high school, Richard got a stable job as a computer operator from Blue Cross Blue Shield. Despite the fact that Richard's life seemed to begin perfectly normal and he appeared to be a productive member of society, he would turn to crime at a very young age. He was just 21 when he committed his first killing. The victim was 29-year-old Nicole Shavia Vogel. Nicole, who was a mother of 2, left her home one night to go play bingo at her church with some friends. She was never seen alive again. Her naked body was discovered laying inside of her car in Ridgefield Park, New Jersey. Her hands had been tied in front of her, and she was covered by a blanket. She had been to death. The year was 1967. While Richard wasn't caught for this killing at the time, he was caught several years later for drinking and driving. He was made to pay a fee, and he also had to spend 10 days in jail. In 1972, when he was 23 years old, Richard got married. His wife's name was Janet Cottingham, and the two would go on to have 3 children, 2 sons and 1 daughter. Richard was hardly the father of the year and got mixed up in plenty of criminal activity, while his children were still quite young. His second victim was just 18 years old. Her name was Irene Blaze, and she was from Hackensack, New Jersey. After she went missing, she was later located floating face down in the Saddle River. She had been to death, either by some sort of cord or more likely from her own cross necklace she wore hanging from a chain around her neck. Richard's next victim was even younger, at just 15 years old. Her name was Denise Falaska, and she was from Emerson, New Jersey. She was walking over to a friend's house when she was abducted by Richard. Her body was found the very next morning, lying near a cemetery. She too had been likely with her own necklace. Richard's next killing occurred in 1977. His target was a 26-year-old woman named Marianne Carr. When she first disappeared, it was New Jersey detective Alan Greco who received the report.
We received a call that a young married woman was reported missing from her apartment complex in Little Ferry, New Jersey, under suspicious circumstances. Marianne was an X-ray technician who had been married a short period of time. They lived in a garden apartment. There were very strange circumstances in that the report came from her husband, who was away on a business trip.
Marianne had missed an appointment to visit with her mother-in-law that evening, and her husband was worried that something had happened to her. He wanted Detective Greco to check out the apartment to make sure that everything was in order. When the detective arrived at the residence, it appeared that everything was as it should be.
There did not appear to be anything broken in the apartment, no broken glasses, no forced entry on the door. and we had no indication at all as to what had happened to Mary Ann Carr.
Despite her husband's reported absence.
While Mary Ann's apartment may have appeared normal, there had been a suspicious sighting in her same apartment complex around the time she was thought to be missing. The individual said that she had been backing his car out of the lot and preparing to leave when he glanced through his rearview mirror and saw a man who he at the time thought was Mary Ann's husband. What he nor police initially realized was that Mary Ann's husband very much resembled that of Richard. At the time, Richard was known as someone who had a few run-ins with the law, but was not yet known as a killer. To most anyone else, he was just an insurance salesman. He worked alongside his coworker, Dominic Volpe. In fact, the pair worked side by side for 13 years.
I and Richard worked on the console together, chatting a lot. He was well-read, and he was up-to-date on current events. He read a lot of stuff about medicine. He was pretty smart.
Meanwhile, Detective Greco was still on the hunt for missing person Mary Ann Carr. It was with great disappointment that he ended up getting the tragic call that a body that was likely Mary Ann had been discovered. The body was clothed in a white nurse's uniform, and it was located in the parking lot of a motel.
Mary Ann Carr's body had ligature marks on the wrists and the ankles from handcuffs. So we knew that handcuffs were used in Mary Ann Carr's murder. And she had a ligature mark along the aspect of her neck.
Police had no idea why someone would have targeted Mary Ann, or how she ended up in such a strange location.
We had no idea of how she had gotten to where she was found, nor why she was there, nor who would have been responsible for removing her from her apartment and taking her there.
Meanwhile, Richard Cunningham was continuing on with his violent, abusive lifestyle. By 1978, his wife had filed for divorce from him. She claimed that he was mentally cruel, would stay out all hours of the night, and would not bring home enough money to care for her or their children. By the following year, Richard targeted his next victim. Her name was Valerie Ann Street. She was 19 years old, and her badly beaten body was discovered in the same motel parking lot that Mary Ann Carr's was. Valerie's hands had been handcuffed behind her back, and there were signs of tape having been used to cover her mouth to keep her from screaming. She had died of asphyxiation. Just weeks after killing Valerie, Richard then went after a woman named Jean Ryder, who he killed at the historic Seville Hotel. After her and her throat, he disturbingly mutilated her body for his own satisfaction and pleasure. He then lit fire to the mattress her body was laying on and fled the scene. Richard's final attack was in May of 1980. His victim was 18-year-old Leslie Ann Odell. She had been standing on a street corner, soliciting, when she was approached by Richard. The two talked, and she agreed to have relations with him for a payment of $100. They booked a hotel room, and he managed to handcuff her. Then he tortured her brutally, even to the point of nearly biting off parts of her body. While in court, Leslie would later testify that while torturing her, Richard told her, "You have to take it. The other girls did. You have to take it too. You're a and you have to be punished." While she would have likely become another one of Richard's victims, luckily hotel staff members heard cries of pain and called police. Police would soon arrive, force Richard to open the door, and at long last, he was arrested. His initial charges included assault, possession of a weapon, and possession of controlled substances. It wasn't until years later that he finally was convicted for 5 different murders. At the time, he pled innocent and claimed that even the torture he had inflicted upon Leslie Ann Odell had been consensual, and that she had wanted him to treat her in such a horrific way. Despite the fact that there was so much evidence against him and he couldn't look more guilty, Richard decided that he would make one last attempt to escape.
I had briefly left the courtroom and gone downstairs to my office, and as I came back into the courtroom, I immediately saw the matron in a frenzy running from the area of the holding cell, and without her saying a word, I knew that he escaped.
Richard had just taken to the stand to testify on his own behalf, and there had been a break in proceedings when he decided to make a run for it. A prosecutor who had been on the scene at the time recalled Richard's last-ditch effort.
took a jacket and threw it against the sheriff's officer's face, befuddled the sheriff's officer, and went out one of the back stairways.
I could see him running from the courthouse across the street.
We chased him across the street.
Another sheriff's officer had spotted him as well, and we both tackled him on the street and put him in handcuffs and restrained him and brought him back to the courthouse.
Luckily, Richard Conningham would make no more escapes. He was eventually sentenced to life in prison. In 2010 and then in 2021, he would confess to the murders of Nancy Vogel, Lorraine Marie Kelly, Marianne Pryor, and 2 unnamed schoolgirls from New Jersey. He is now 75 years old and will live out his days in prison. While he was only convicted for 8 different murders, it is believed that he could actually be responsible for more than 11. It's often unusual for killers to turn themselves in after they've gone free for many years. After all, they've gotten away with it for so long, why risk the rest of their lives in prison? But sometimes guilt can take a toll on their mental health, causing them to want to own up to their grave mistake. This can become especially hard for those nearing closer and closer to death and expecting to face judgment for the way they've lived their lives. Detective Sean Mukadam is an officer out of Decatur, Alabama. He's received a lot of interesting calls throughout his years as a detective, but one of the strangest was likely one that he received on what started as a normal day in mid-November of 2020. The caller identified themselves as 53-year-old Johnny DeWitt Whited. Johnny was a resident from Trinity, Alabama, not far from Decatur. Johnny explained to Detective Mukadam that he wanted to confess to a murder of a man. His memory surrounding the details of the murder, he didn't know the man's name or even the precise date of the killing. He did remember that he had shot the man only once. He provided the detective with the date he suspected the murder occurred, and police looked over their records to see if there was any cold cases they had matching his story for that year, but they found nothing. As they continued to question Johnny, he described the setting in which the killing took place. Police began to put clues together, and before long, they finally found a cold case that matched what Johnny described. Shockingly, it dated all the way back to the 1980s. At the time, Johnny was still beginning his life at only 28 years old. The date was April 26, 1995, and 26-year-old Christopher Alvin Daly had recently gone missing. His family was very concerned and had reported his disappearance. Christopher was employed as a server at the Hilton Hotel, located in Huntsville, Alabama. He had worked his typical shift at the hotel the day before, but after that he went radio silent and hadn't been in contact with any of his family or friends, something that was unlike him. It wasn't long after Christopher had been reported missing that 2 teenage boys traveled to a wooded area not far from a road. They had planned to try and find special leaves for a nature project they were working on. Unfortunately, they ended up finding much more than they could have ever bargained for. While searching for leaves, they ended up stumbling across a man's dead body. They reported it, and police quickly arrived at the scene. The man had been shot once in the head, and the man was later identified as Christopher Daly. Not far from where Christopher's body was located, police found his abandoned vehicle. It was a 1983 tan Toyota that had been floating only partially underwater in the Tennessee River. How it got there was not immediately clear, but police were able to determine that it was in fact Christopher's body because his ID and wallet had been left in the car. This was a particularly odd case, as police had virtually no lead. They didn't know who could have been out to hurt Christopher or why. There was no determined motive. They also had never retrieved the murder weapon. Despite working on this case for years, they found very little information, and before long, the case had become cold. It seemed as if the case was entirely hopeless, and that Christopher's loved ones would never get the answers they so desperately needed for closure in connection to his loss. No arrests were made, and it appeared there never would be. But everything changed that day in 2020, when Johnny suddenly and surprisingly came forward with a confession. After Johnny had first contacted Detective Mukadam in regards to the killing, he told him he thought that they should meet in person to discuss the details and so that he could show him where the event took place. The detective was hesitant about this at first. He wasn't certain about Johnny's story and questioned whether or not he could just be a crazy person who had made the whole thing up in hopes of gaining some sort of fame. There was also a safety concern, as it was possible that if they met in person, Johnny would attempt to attack him. Nevertheless, eventually he agreed to meet up with him. Detective Mukadam picked Johnny up in a cruiser and followed his instructions as the man claiming to be a killer directed him to a secluded area of Decatur, Alabama. Eventually, Johnny told the detective to stop and park the car. He explained that they would need to walk on foot in order to reach the location where he had allegedly shot Christopher. The pair made their way through a wooded area and ended up in what was in fact the same location where Christopher's body was found. Now, believing Johnny was telling the truth, the detective again followed his instructions to an area near the banks of the Tennessee River. Johnny explained to him that this was where he had attempted to submerge Christopher's car so that any evidence would be destroyed. After he managed to get the vehicle to the edge of the banks, Johnny said that he had secured a rock onto the accelerator of the car. He then pushed the car into the water himself. At this point, Detective Mukadam now fully believed that Johnny had been telling the truth when he had confessed to this killing. This was because not only did these locations match the locations listed on the police report connected to Christopher's case, but Johnny also knew specific details about these locations that no one outside of those working on the case but the killer himself would have known. Yeah, he could have rehearsed it, but it really started to click then. He gave me specifics about the vehicle and how it entered the river, things only crime scene techs would know, the detective would later say in a message that was printed by the press. The only questions remaining were first, why had Johnny killed Christopher, and second, why did he admit to it after all these years when he could have likely gone the rest of his life and gotten away with it? Johnny did have a response, at least for one of these questions. As to why he decided to confess, it was due to a serious illness and the fact that he was coming to the end of his life. Johnny was dying of stage 4 lung cancer and believed he would soon face God and provide some sort of explanation for the acts he committed during his lifetime. He believed he couldn't die peacefully without finally getting this major weight off his chest. As for the motive, this he had little explanation for. He explained that he hadn't known Christopher before killing him. He also was not known as a violent person. However, could have certainly played a factor in why he had decided to do what he did. Throughout his lifetime, Johnny had struggled with the use of an illegal substance, and in fact, just a few weeks before he had come forward to confess the killing of Christopher, Johnny had been in illegal trouble for possessing an illegal substance. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of this case is that prior to confessing, Johnny was at no point considered a suspect in connection to this case. If he had stayed silent, he would have likely eventually passed away, and the case would have never been solved.
Yesterday, Johnny Whited called Decatur police confessing to the murder. Detectives met with Whited, and the information he provided matched the evidence they had from the case. Whited was charged and arrested, and he's now at the Morgan County Jail on a $15,000 bond.
Whited's current health condition has not been released to the public, but it is known that he did post bail and was initially released before his trial. He's being represented by an attorney named Griff Bessler, who said in a statement, "I intend to proceed just as I would in any other criminal case," Bessler said. "I'll review any and all evidence and begin preparing a trial strategy for his defense."